A quiet girl's life takes an unexpected turn when she is accused of cheating by her teacher. As the investigation unfolds, startling evidence emerges, challenging everyone's assumptions. What will happen when the real truth comes out? Stick around to see how this story unfolds and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Shyla, could you stay after class for a moment? Mr. Davis's voice sliced through the dull hum of a high school history classroom. The bell had just rung and students were already filing out with their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Shyla Taylor, a quiet girl who rarely made waves, froze mid-step and glanced nervously toward the teacher's desk. Her stomach nodded as whispers broke out around her. "What'd she do?" one boy muttered. "Bet she cheated," another snickered, loud enough for Shyla to hear. Her cheeks flushed, but she kept her head down and slowly walked to Mr. Davis's desk. The seasoned teacher adjusted his glasses and tapped a piece of paper on the desk, her recently completed history exam. "Shyla, can you explain this?" he asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Shyla stared at the paper, noting the bold red 95% scrawled across the top corner. "I don't understand, Mr. Davis," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt the weight of the room's lingering gazes, the last few students taking their time to leave. "Shyla," Mr. Davis began, leaning back in his chair. "This is a remarkable improvement from your last few exams. You barely passed the midterm, and now you're scoring in the top 5% of the class? It's suspicious, to say the least." Shyla's throat tightened. "I studied really hard for this test," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been staying late at the library, taking notes, and I just tried my best." Mr. Davis sighed, his expression skeptical. "I'm not accusing you outright, but you have to admit this kind of jump in performance raises some questions." "Huh? Questions?" Shyla's voice cracked, her usual timid demeanor replaced with a flash of defiance. "Are you saying someone like me isn't supposed to get an A?" "That's not what I'm saying," Mr. Davis replied quickly, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. "I just need to verify that everything was above board. You understand that, don't you?" "No," Shyla shot back, surprising even herself. "I don't understand why I have to explain myself for doing well on a test. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do?" Her tone drew startled looks from the few students still loitering in the doorway. Mr. Davis cleared his throat and gestured toward the paper. "I'll need to speak to the principal about this. For now, you're suspended pending an investigation." "Suspended?" Shyla gasped, the word cutting through her like a blade. "I didn't do anything wrong. This isn't fair." "I'm sorry, Shyla," Mr. Davis said, though his tone carried little warmth. "But the school has a zero-tolerance policy for academic dishonesty. If you can provide evidence of your studying or preparation, it'll help your case." Shyla's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. "Evidence? How do I prove that I stayed up late reading history textbooks in the library? Do you want me to bring in my notebook or have the librarian vouch?" "That would be a start," Mr. Davis replied, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. Shyla grabbed her backpack, the weight of her frustration and humiliation making her movements stiff. She wanted to yell, to argue, but she knew it wouldn't change anything. The damage was done. As she walked toward the door, the whispers followed her, like a shadow. "Come in." The ride home on the school bus was unbearable. Shyla kept her gaze glued to the passing streets, ignoring the glances and hushed murmurs from her classmates. "Guess she finally got caught," one girl whispered to her friend. "Always thought she was too quiet to be innocent," another added. Shyla clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her mind raced, replaying the conversation with Mr. Davis over and over. What more could she have done to prove herself? Was her hard work always going to be overshadowed by assumptions? When the bus pulled up to her stop, Shyla stepped off quickly, eager to escape the stares. Her neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where every house looked identical, with neat lawns and white picket fences. But for Shyla, it was a refuge from the chaos of school. Inside, her mother, Denise, was busy folding laundry on the living room couch. "Hey, sweetie," she said without looking up. "How was school?" Shyla dropped her backpack by the door and hesitated. "Mom," she began, her voice shaky, "I got suspended today." Denise froze, the shirt in her hand slipping onto the floor. "What? For what? What happened?" she asked, her tone a mix of confusion and concern. "They think I cheated on my history test," Shyla said, her voice breaking as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't, Mom. I swear I didn't." Denise pulled her daughter into a hug, her heart aching at the sight of Shyla's pain. "Oh, baby, I know you didn't," she said softly, stroking her hair. "We're going to figure this out, okay? I'll call the school tomorrow and demand a meeting." Shyla nodded, her mother's embrace offering a small sense of comfort. But deep down, the doubt planted by Mr. Davis's accusation gnawed at her. Would anyone believe her? The next morning, Denise stormed into the school office, Shyla in tow. The principal, Mrs. Henderson, was already waiting for them, her expression neutral but professional. "Thank you for coming in," Mrs. Henderson began, gesturing for them to sit. "I understand this is a difficult situation, but we need to ensure academic integrity is upheld." "Let me make this clear," Denise said, her voice firm. "My daughter did not cheat. She's been working her tail off to improve her grades, and this is how you reward her?" Mrs. Henderson raised a hand, her tone measured. "We're not here to punish Shyla unnecessarily. However, given the significant jump in her performance, we need to investigate further. The teacher's suspicions were not made lightly." Denise scoffed. "Oh, I'm sure they weren't, but let me ask you this. If Shyla were any other student, would we even be having this conversation?" Mrs. Henderson's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Our policies apply to all students equally." "Do they?" Denise challenged. "Because it sure seems like my daughter is being singled out for daring to succeed." The tension in the room was palpable. Shyla sat silently, her hands clenched in her lap as the adults debated her future. Finally, Mrs. Henderson sighed. "We'll review the classroom security footage to determine what happened during the exam. If Shyla's actions are consistent with her claims, her suspension will be lifted immediately." Denise nodded, her jaw tight with resolve. "You do that. And when you find out she's innocent, I expect a public apology." Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Understood." Back at home, Shyla tried to focus on her schoolwork, but her mind kept drifting. She thought about the hours she'd spent at the library, poring over textbooks and practice tests. She thought about her classmates' whispers and Mr. Davis's disappointed gaze. Most of all, she thought about how easily her efforts had been dismissed. As the sun set, Shyla opened her notebook and began writing, her pencil flying across the page. If no one else was going to believe in her, she would document every step of her journey. She listed the books she'd read, the notes she'd taken, and the hours she'd spent preparing for the test. It wasn't much, but it was her truth. And someday, she vowed, the world would see it too. Mr. Davis sat in his quiet classroom after school, staring at Shyla's exam paper. The numbers and dates written in her neat handwriting seemed to mock him. A perfect answer on the essay question about Reconstruction-era policies, a flawless timeline of key events, things even his most dedicated students struggled to grasp. How could a student who barely passed her last exam produce this? It didn't add up. He flipped through her previous tests, the sharp contrasts in her responses only fueling his doubts. "She must have found a way to cheat," he murmured, almost convincing himself. But as he leaned back in his chair, an unease settled over him. What if he'd been wrong? Meanwhile, at Shyla's house, she sat at the dining table surrounded by books and notes. Her laptop, a second-hand model with a flickering screen, displayed a history lesson she'd watched repeatedly over the last week. Her mother, Denise, walked in, placing a warm mug of cocoa beside her. "Take a break, baby," Denise said softly, watching her daughter scribble furiously in a notebook. Shyla hesitated, her pencil pausing mid-sentence. "I can't, Mom," she said, her voice tight. "If I stop now, it'll be like they were right about me." Denise frowned, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. Shy, listen to me. You've got nothing to prove to them. We both know how hard you've worked. And they don't know, Mom, Shyla replied, her voice trembling. They just see a girl like me and think I don't belong in the top 5%. They think I cheated. Denise reached across the table, squeezing Shyla's hand. Then we'll make them see. Tomorrow, when they review that footage, they'll realize you're not just smart, you're unstoppable. Shyla nodded, her mother's words offering a sliver of hope. The next day, Mr. Davis found himself in the school's administrative office, where Mrs. Henderson and the school IT specialist were waiting. On a large monitor, a time-stamped video of the history classroom played, showing students hunched over their desks during the exam. Mr. Davis folded his arms, leaning in closer. He was certain this would reveal the truth. "Let's start here," Mrs. Henderson said, pointing at the timestamp that matched the beginning of the test. The footage played out in real time. Shyla sat at her desk, her head bent over her paper. She didn't look around or interact with anyone. Her pencil moved steadily across the page, pausing occasionally as she thought. Beside her, another student leaned back, tapping his pencil against the desk, while another flipped through her notes discreetly. As the footage continued, Mr. Davis began to shift uncomfortably. He watched as Shyla raised her hand to ask for extra paper halfway through the exam. The video showed him walking over, handing her more paper, and then returning to his desk. At no point did Shyla exhibit behavior consistent with cheating. "What do you think, Mr. Davis?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her tone measured. "Do you see any evidence of misconduct?" He hesitated, clearing his throat. Not yet. Keep playing it." The IT specialist nodded, scrubbing through the footage. Toward the end of the exam, a group of students near the back caught Mr. Davis's attention. They exchanged glances and subtly passed a piece of paper between desks. Mr. Davis leaned forward, his heart sinking as he realized they were the real culprits. "There," he said, pointing at the screen. "Go back a few seconds." The IT specialist rewound the footage, zooming in on the group. The paper, now clearly visible, had small, scribbled notes on it. As the specialist enhanced the image further, it became evident that the students had been sharing answers. Mrs. Henderson leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "So, Mr. Davis, what do you make of this?" He rubbed his temples, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. I owe Shyla an apology. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment." "Yes," Mrs. Henderson replied curtly. "And it's not just her you owe. This has implications for the entire class. You'll need to address this properly." Shyla was called to the principal's office during lunch. Her heart pounded as she walked down the hallway, ignoring the curious stares of her classmates. When she arrived, she found Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davis waiting for her. "Have a seat, Shyla," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice softer than usual. Shyla sat down, clutching her backpack tightly. Her eyes darted between the two adults, searching for clues. "Shyla," Mr. Davis began, his voice heavy with regret. "I owe you a sincere apology. We reviewed the security footage and it's clear you didn't cheat. In fact, your work was entirely your own, and I was wrong to accuse you." Shyla blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "So, I'm not suspended anymore?" "Correct," Mrs. Henderson said. "Your suspension has been lifted, effective immediately, and Mr. Davis has something else he'd like to say." Mr. Davis cleared his throat, his gaze meeting Shyla's. "I misjudged you, Shyla, and I realize now that my assumptions were unfair. You've shown incredible dedication, and I see that I underestimated you. I hope you can forgive me." Shyla's throat tightened, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," she said honestly. "But thank you for telling me the truth." Her response, though measured, struck Mr. Davis deeply. He nodded, respecting her honesty. "There's one more thing," Mrs. Henderson added. "The students who were actually cheating have been identified and will face disciplinary action. And as for you, Shyla, I'd like to commend your resilience. You've handled this situation with grace, and I think it's time we celebrated your hard work." Shyla's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Henderson smiled. "Your history teacher has agreed to nominate you for a scholarship program for outstanding students. It's the least we can do." Shyla felt a swell of emotion, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "We'll make them see." The school buzzed with rumors by the end of the day. Word of the footage had spread, and students who had once whispered about Shyla now looked at her with newfound respect. Some even approached her to apologize for doubting her. As Shyla packed up her belongings, Mr. Davis appeared in the doorway. "Shyla, do you have a moment?" She nodded, standing by her desk as he approached. "I wanted to give you this," he said, handing her a stack of printed materials. "It's information about the scholarship program. I think you have a real shot at it." "Thank you," Shyla said quietly, her fingers brushing the papers. "For everything." "No," Mr. Davis replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for reminding me why I became a teacher. To believe in my students, not doubt them." Shyla nodded, a small smile breaking through her usual reserve. As she left the classroom, she felt lighter than she had in days. For the first time, she saw herself not as the quiet girl who went unnoticed, but as someone who deserved to be seen. And this time, the world was watching. Shyla stepped into her history classroom the next morning with her head held high. The familiar hum of chatter fell silent as her classmates noticed her arrival. For a moment, she hesitated, but then, recalling the conversation in the principal's office, she straightened her shoulders and walked to her desk. The whispers that once followed her were gone, replaced by an awkward silence. "Hey, Shyla," a girl called from the back row, her voice hesitant. It was Caroline, one of the students who had laughed when Shyla was accused. I just wanted to say sorry. I should have stood up for you." Shyla blinked, surprised. Caroline avoided eye contact, fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "I didn't think you did it," Caroline added, her voice softer now. "But I didn't say anything, and that was wrong." For a moment, Shyla didn't know how to respond. She had spent the last few days feeling invisible, misunderstood, and unfairly judged. To hear someone admit their mistake, even in a small way, felt like a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself. "It's okay," Shyla said, though the words felt heavy. "Thanks for saying that." Caroline nodded, relief flashing across her face. Around the room, other students glanced her way, some offering hesitant smiles, others looking away entirely. When the bell rang, Mr. Davis stood at the front of the class, clearing his throat to quiet the room. "Before we begin today's lesson, I need to address something," he said. His tone was steady, but Shyla noticed his hands gripping the podium a little too tightly. "As some of you may know," he continued, his gaze scanning the room, "I recently made a serious error in judgment. I accused Shyla Taylor of academic dishonesty without sufficient evidence, and I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my view, and I want to publicly apologize to Shyla for my actions." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as students exchanged surprised glances. Shyla felt her cheeks flush, the sudden spotlight making her want to shrink into her seat. But as Mr. Davis continued, she lifted her head, her heart pounding. Shyla's performance on the last exam wasn't just the result of hard work. It was exceptional, and I should have seen it for what it was instead of doubting her. I hope we can all learn something from this, myself included. He paused, then added, "Shyla, thank you for your patience and for handling this with grace. You've taught me more than I've taught you this week." The room was silent for a moment, and then someone clapped. It was a slow, hesitant clap at first, but it spread until the entire room joined in. Shyla's eyes stung with tears, but she forced a small smile and nodded in acknowledgement. For the first time in days, she felt seen, not as a suspect, but as someone worthy of respect. After class, Mr. Davis approached Shyla as she packed her bag. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. Shyla nodded, following him into the hallway. The air between them was tense, but Mr. Davis's expression was earnest. "I wanted to tell you something I didn't mention in class," he said. "I've already submitted your nomination for the Regional Scholars Program. The principal and I both agreed you deserve this opportunity." Shyla's eyes widened. "Yes," he said with a nod. "The scholarship is competitive, but I have no doubt you'll stand out. You've already proven you're capable of incredible things." "Thank you," Shyla said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect that." "I owed it to you," he replied. "But more than that, you earned it." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of the last few days hanging between them. Finally Shyla spoke. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, but I appreciate what you're doing now." Mr. Davis nodded, his expression somber. "That's fair, and I'll do everything I can to earn back your trust." Later that evening, Mr. Davis found himself on Shyla's front porch, holding a folder under one arm and a bouquet of flowers in his hand. He took a deep breath before knocking on the door. Moments later, Denise opened it, her expression guarded. "Mr. Davis," she said, her tone neutral, "what are you doing here?" "I came to apologize," he said, holding out the flowers. "And to thank you. Shyla has shown more resilience and strength than I ever expected, and I realize now how much of that comes from you." Denise's eyes softened slightly, though her posture remained firm. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Inside, Shyla was sitting at the dining table, her notebook spread out in front of her. She looked up in surprise as Mr. Davis entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Shyla," he began, placing the flowers on the table, "I wanted to say this in person. I'm sorry for everything. For doubting you, for not believing in you, and for making you feel like you had to prove yourself. You shouldn't have had to go through that." Shyla stared at him for a moment, her emotions swirling. Finally she said, "Thank you for saying that." Mr. Davis nodded, his relief visible. "I also wanted to share something with you." He opened the folder, revealing a letter. "This is the confirmation of your nomination for the scholarship. If you're accepted, it could cover your tuition for college." Shyla's eyes widened as she took the letter. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep being the incredible person you already are," Mr. Davis said with a small smile. "Because the world needs more students like you." Denise placed a hand on Shyla's shoulder, her pride evident. "We'll take it from here, Mr. Davis. Thank you." As Mr. Davis left, Shyla sat back down, staring at the letter in her hands. For the first time in days, hope blossomed in her chest. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew she was ready to face it. The next week, Shyla stood in front of her class, presenting a project on the Harlem Renaissance. Her voice was clear and confident, her knowledge shining through every word. Mr. Davis watched from the back of the room, a proud smile on his face. He had doubted her once, but now he saw her for who she truly was, a bright, determined young woman with the potential to change the world. When the presentation ended, the class erupted in applause. Shyla smiled, the sound filling her with a sense of accomplishment she'd never felt before. As she returned to her seat, Caroline leaned over and whispered, "You killed it." Shyla grinned, her confidence growing with every step. For the first time, she wasn't just the quiet girl in the back of the class. She was someone who had fought for her place and won. And as the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Shyla knew this was only the beginning.